Millionaire mocked Black Waitress. She responded in 9 languages and earned $100K. It's a quiet evening at a high-end restaurant in the heart of downtown, the kind of place where the rich don't just eat, they flaunt. You can smell the fresh-cut herbs in the air, hear the soft clink of expensive wine glasses, and see the glint of the crystal chandeliers above. But in the midst of this, a single moment happens. One that changes everything. A millionaire, let's call him Greg, looks down at his phone, scrolling through messages. He's wearing that smug, arrogant smile that makes you want to punch him. He's used to getting what he wants. He's sitting at a table for 2, ordering the most expensive wine, as though he owns the entire restaurant. And then, in the blink of an eye, something shifts. He looks up and sees her. Her name's Tiffany. She's just doing her job, walking up to his table with a tray. But he doesn't see her as a person. He sees her as a stereotype, a woman of color who's nothing more than a servant in his world. Is it too much to ask for someone to speak English around here? Greg sneers, barely looking up. Tiffany stands frozen, her heart sinking as the words hit her like a slap. The entire room goes silent. It's the kind of moment that makes your skin crawl. Tiffany's face flushes, but not from embarrassment. She's pissed, and in that moment, she's done being silent. What happens next is something Greg never saw coming. It's a twist you couldn't even imagine. Tiffany doesn't just stand there, holding the tray like a passive, invisible being. She opens her mouth, and what comes out? A response, in not just 1 language, but 9, and that right there is where the story begins. But here's the kicker. This moment, this response, this fire that ignites in her, turns into something that changes her life forever. Greg doesn't know it yet, but he's just made the biggest mistake of his life. You see, this isn't just about one rude comment or some waitress defending herself. It's about how Tiffany turns the tables, no pun intended, and walks out of that night with a paycheck that's worth $100K. You've got to wonder, how does that happen? How does a single interaction lead to a life-changing opportunity? You're about to find out. But trust me, you're not going to believe what comes next. Stay with me, because this story, right here, could change the way you see everything. And when you find out the truth about what happens next, it's going to leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, privilege, and the voice of someone you'd least expect. ChatGPT said, Tiffany had always worked harder than most. But that's what happens when you come from nothing. Born in the small suburbs of Atlanta, she knew what it felt like to struggle. Money didn't come easy in her world. She was raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to put food on the table. Tiffany had seen firsthand how the world could treat you when you didn't fit the mold of what society said you should be. She wasn't rich. She wasn't famous. But she was determined to make something of herself. At 25, Tiffany was working as a waitress at the Velvet Lounge, a swanky restaurant that had become the go-to spot for the city's elite. The place had a vibe that oozed class, low jazz music playing softly in the background, silver spoons clinking in fine china, and rich people wearing their success like a second skin. For most, it was a luxury to be there, a moment to show off their new outfits, their wealth, their power. But for Tiffany, it was just another night on the job. She'd worked at the Velvet for 2 years, long enough to know exactly how it worked. The regulars had their routines. Bottle of wine before the main course, never ask for recommendations, always look down their nose at the help. And Greg, he was one of those regulars. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was the type of person who thought his money gave him the right to look down on anyone who didn't match his image of success. Tiffany had seen his kind come and go. They smiled when they needed something, but when it came to the service staff, it was all condescension and snide comments. Tiffany didn't care about his wealth. She wasn't there to make friends with rich people. She was there to pay the bills and put food on the table. She was saving every penny she could, dreaming of the day she could open her own art gallery, a space where she could showcase the art of people from her community. But for now, she was stuck in this endless loop of serving drinks to people who never saw her as anything more than a means to their next indulgence. It hurt sometimes, especially when she saw how easily they dismissed her. The subtle looks, the condescending tone when they ordered their drinks, as if she were somehow beneath them. Tonight, however, something felt different. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the air in the restaurant, thick with tension, or the way the guests seemed more on edge than usual. But Tiffany couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. She tried to push the thought aside as she moved through the room, weaving between tables with practiced grace, balancing trays in one hand and a smile on her face. She was used to the fake pleasantries, the way people would ask her about her day as though they genuinely cared, knowing full well they'd forgotten her name the moment she walked away. Then, she saw him, Greg. He was sitting with a group of his colleagues, laughing loudly as though the restaurant was his personal stage. The laughter didn't reach his eyes, though. His expression was tight, his jaw clenched like he was always ready to pounce. Tiffany had served him 100 times before, but tonight, something in the way he looked at her felt different. Maybe it was because his table was the one closest to the bar, or maybe it was the smug way he leaned back in his chair as he surveyed the room. She approached their table, carefully balancing a tray of drinks. She smiled, the kind of smile she had perfected over the years, one that was both warm and professional. But as soon as she set the drinks down, she felt his eyes on her. Tiffany could feel the heat of his gaze, like he was trying to look right through her. "Excuse me." Greg's voice cut through the air like a knife. She turned to face him, keeping her cool. "Yeah? Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice steady, even though the hairs on the back of her neck were standing up. He looked her up and down, his eyes flicking over her as if he was judging her every move. Then with a smirk, he spoke. "You know, it's kind of funny that you're still working here, huh? You'd think that by now you'd have learned to speak English properly." "No offense, but I can barely understand you." Tiffany froze. The words hit her like a slap in the face. She had heard microaggressions before, but this was different. She had heard it all. "Go back to where you came from. Why don't you learn to speak American?" But Greg's words felt personal, like a direct attack on who she was. Tiffany's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her expression neutral. She wasn't going to let him get to her. Not tonight. Not when she had worked so hard to get this far. But inside, something inside her started to shift. Maybe it was the years of putting up with comments like these. Maybe it was the weight of her dreams for the future. Or maybe it was just the pure, unfiltered rage she felt in that moment. But she knew something had to change. As she turned away from Greg's table, she fought the urge to say something, anything. But she swallowed it down. She wasn't about to let him win. Not tonight. She had work to do, and she had a lot more important things to focus on. But the feeling, the injustice, the anger, it would linger. It would simmer. Later, when the restaurant was closing and the last guests were leaving, Tiffany found herself at the bar, absent-mindedly cleaning a glass. Her fingers ran over the smooth surface, lost in thought. And then it happened. Greg's voice echoed through the empty space, cutting through the silence. "Hey, can I get the check?" he called out, still unaware of the storm brewing behind the counter. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe it was the way he had looked at her like she was less than human. Maybe it was the way he'd made her feel small. But as she turned around to grab the check, something inside her snapped. She couldn't let this go. Not tonight. She walked over to Greg's table, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what she was going to say or do, but she knew one thing. This would be the last time someone ever treated her like that. The night started like any other. Tiffany had just finished another long shift at the Velvet Lounge, already exhausted from the back-to-back orders and the constant pressure to be perfect. But this time, as she stepped out into the cool Atlanta air, something felt different. It wasn't just the weight of the rude comment Greg had dropped on her. No, it was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was at a breaking point. She stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, her breath visible in the chilly night air, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights. Her mind raced, and the adrenaline from the encounter kept her awake, each thought sharper than the last. It wasn't the first time someone had treated her like that, but something about Greg's words had stung more than usual. Something in his eyes told her he thought she was nothing more than a helping hand, a face to serve his needs. Tiffany's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, seeing a message from her mom. "How was your shift?" "I hope you're okay, love." Tiffany sighed. Her mom, like her, worked hard, but it was never enough. They were both caught in a never-ending cycle of trying to make ends meet. She typed a quick reply. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired. I'll call you later." But deep down, Tiffany knew she wasn't fine. She hadn't been for a while. It had been 2 years since she first started working at the Velvet Lounge, And in that time, she had become a seasoned pro at navigating the microaggressions that came with the job. The subtle slights, the way certain customers would slow down their speech when speaking to her, as though she couldn't understand English. The way they would forget her name after they'd just introduced themselves. It was exhausting, but it was something she had learned to cope with. Tiffany had worked in restaurants her whole life. But this place, the fancy, upscale kind where money flowed like water, was a different animal. The wealthy had their own set of rules, a code that didn't allow for outsiders like Tiffany to cross into their world. And when she had first started at the Velvet Lounge, she thought she could just play the game, do her job, and stay invisible. But she soon realized that being invisible didn't stop the treatment. It wasn't just the customers, it was the system. The tips were good. She had to admit that. But the constant pressure to look perfect, to cater to the needs of people who barely acknowledged her humanity, had started to eat away at her. She had witnessed things that made her stomach turn. Racist comments hidden behind polite smiles, subtle discrimination that nobody seemed to notice unless they were in her shoes. Like when Greg had left that night, he didn't just tip poorly. He dropped an extra $10, but his words, those words, had cut deeper than anything he'd put in her pocket. She'd been working hard, too hard to let this slide. Tiffany took a deep breath and glanced at the neon sign for the Velvet Lounge as it flickered in the distance. She had to get some rest, but all she could think about was how much longer she could endure this. As she drove home, her mind kept replaying the night's events. She tried to shake it off, to push the feeling away, but it clung to her like the humidity in the air. The flashing memories from the night before when customers had turned their noses up at her, the ones who had made snide remarks about those people being in the kitchen. This had been the final straw. Once she reached her small apartment, Tiffany plopped down on the couch and closed her eyes for a few moments. The sound of the fridge humming, the city's noise outside, it was all part of the background noise she had learned to tune out. She could hear the soft tapping of the neighbors upstairs, the same rhythm that had followed her through her years of hustle. But this night, something inside her broke. She started to think about what it would take to really change things. To go beyond just surviving and start thriving. To not just nod and smile at the bullshit. To not just let it go. Every time she had stayed quiet, it felt like she was selling pieces of herself to keep the peace, to keep her job, to stay in line. But tonight, that changed. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from her best friend, Kayla. "Hey girl, you all right? I saw Greg leave and you didn't look too happy. What happened?" Tiffany stared at the screen for a while. She didn't want to unload on Kayla, not when things were already tough for her too. But she needed to talk. She typed a response, her fingers moving quickly over the keys. He made a comment. "Just the usual crap, but I can't let it slide anymore. I'm tired." Kayla's reply was immediate. "I get it, girl. You've been putting up with too much. You've got the power to stand up, though. You always have. Don't forget who you are." Tiffany smiled a little at that, but the words stung. She had always been strong, always had to be. But tonight felt different. The next day, as Tiffany prepared for her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She put on her uniform, black dress with the company logo on the sleeve, and looked at herself in the mirror. For a moment, she didn't see the woman who had to cater to people's whims and fake smiles. She saw someone else, someone stronger, but she wasn't sure what that strength looked like yet. When she walked into the Velvet Lounge, she could feel the familiar weight of the unspoken expectations. The manager, Danny, gave her a quick nod as he checked the clock. He didn't acknowledge her with more than the briefest glance. Tiffany had seen this before. It wasn't just the customers who ignored her. It was the whole damn system. As she walked past the bar, Greg was already sitting at his usual spot. His colleagues surrounded him, laughing loudly, as though everything was just another day in paradise. But Tiffany wasn't having it. Not today. She approached them, keeping her head high, trying to shut out the little voice in her head telling her to be careful. But something inside her was ready to break free. Greg looked up as she approached, his smug smile returning. But this time she wasn't the one who was going to back down. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. But the fire in her belly made it a little more forceful than usual. Greg's eyes narrowed. "I'll have another bottle of the Bordeaux, and maybe something that doesn't take so long to get here." he sneered, clearly testing her. Tiffany's heart pounded in her chest. It was happening again, but she wasn't about to let him walk all over her this time. "I'll be right back," she said, her voice a little firmer than usual, before turning away. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. But in her gut, she felt it. The sense that things were building to a tipping point. And if she didn't do something now, it would be too late. The tension in the velvet lounge was palpable as Tiffany walked away from Greg's table. Her mind was racing, but she kept her cool, at least on the outside. Inside, though, her heart was pounding like a drum in her chest. She didn't know what was coming next, but she could feel that everything had changed. For better or worse, there was no going back. As she entered the kitchen, she grabbed the bottle of Bordeaux Greg had ordered. Her hands were steady now, but her thoughts were swirling. It wasn't just Greg anymore. The whole damn system was watching. Every time she took that tray to a table, every time she smiled politely and did her job, she was giving away pieces of herself. But tonight she wasn't going to do that. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. When she returned to Greg's table with the wine, he was still smirking, not even realizing the shift in energy. Tiffany placed the bottle on the table without a word, her gaze steady. But Greg, clearly oblivious to the fire that was simmering beneath her calm exterior, looked up and leaned back in his chair. "Are you going to be rude again?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You sure you're okay with your job here? I mean, you don't exactly seem like you're cut out for this kind of work." Tiffany felt the heat rise in her chest, but this time she didn't back down. Her voice came out low and steady. "I'm perfectly fine, Greg. But if you're trying to make a point, maybe you should look in the mirror first." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with an energy that felt like it could ignite the entire room. Greg blinked, clearly surprised. For the first time that night, he wasn't the one in control. He stared at Tiffany for a moment, his smug smile faltering. But before he could say anything else, the manager, Danny, appeared. "Tiffany, can I speak with you for a second?" His tone was calm, but there was an underlying tension to it. She nodded, trying to remain composed, and followed him to the back of the restaurant, where the staff's break room was. Once they were out of earshot of the customers, Danny turned to her, his face serious. "You can't talk to customers like that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You know how things work around here. If you keep pushing back like that, you could get into real trouble." Tiffany's jaw clenched. She'd been prepared for this. She knew the game all too well. "You're telling me I'm supposed to let people treat me like crap just because they're paying customers? Is that the rules you're talking about?" Danny hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "You're a good worker, Tiffany. You know that. But we can't afford to rock the boat. The management has a reputation to maintain." Tiffany's heart sank. She had heard this speech before, the one about how her worth wasn't tied to her dignity but to her ability to serve people who didn't give a damn about her. She'd seen other staff members get the same talk, watched as they were coerced into silence for the sake of peace in the restaurant. But she wasn't going to stay quiet this time. "I'm tired of it, Danny. I'm tired of pretending like it's okay to be invisible. I'm tired of bending over backward for people who think they can say whatever they want because they've got money." Danny's face softened, but his voice was still measured. "I get it, I do. But this isn't just about you or Greg. You're not the only one here trying to make a living. You're putting a lot of people's jobs at risk if you start speaking out like this." Tiffany clenched her fists, taking a deep breath. She felt the weight of the entire restaurant's expectations on her shoulders. The burden of being a black woman in a high-end restaurant, trying to carve out a space for herself in a world that didn't want her there. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going with the mask of politeness, with the constant pressure to conform. She looked Danny in the eye, her voice firm but calm. "I'm not going to let this slide anymore. I can't. I've been doing this job, playing by your rules for too long. But it's time for me to speak up." "If you can't handle that, then I'm out." Danny didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at her, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but you've got to be careful. Don't let this go too far." Tiffany didn't say anything in response. She just walked back to the front, her heart still racing but her mind clearer than ever. She had taken the first step. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Back at her apartment that night, Tiffany couldn't sleep. The weight of what had happened that evening hung over her like a storm cloud, its presence undeniable. She felt both proud and scared. Proud that she had stood up for herself, but terrified of what the consequences might be. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Kayla. "Girl, you all right? I saw what went down with Greg. Are you good?" Tiffany smiled, though it was a tired smile. "I'm good for now, but I'm done keeping quiet. Something's got to change." Kayla's reply was instant. "You've got this, Tiff. You've always been the strongest person I know. Don't let them silence you." The words were comforting, but Tiffany knew that wasn't the end of it. She had crossed a line, and she wasn't sure how far it would take her or how deep the fallout would go. But something inside her knew she couldn't turn back. As she lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about her dreams. The art gallery she wanted to open, the freedom to create without being shackled by the expectations of a system that never cared about people like her. Tonight she had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to be quiet, to stay in their place. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, she couldn't help but wonder, would anyone have her back? Or would she be left to fight this battle alone? The next few days after Tiffany's confrontation with Greg felt like the calm before a storm. Every time she walked into the Velvet Lounge, she could feel the tension in the air. Her co-workers looked at her differently now, not with judgment, but with a kind of reluctant respect. They knew what she had done, but that respect also came with fear, the fear of retaliation, the fear of what might happen next. But Tiffany wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had already taken the hardest step. She'd spoken up. And if that cost her the job, then at least she wouldn't have to live with the weight of silence on her shoulders. But she didn't realize just how far the storm was about to go. That night, she was called into the manager's office again. This time it was different. There was no hesitation in Danny's voice, no soft words of caution. It was cold. He was just doing his job. "Tiffany," he said, his eyes avoiding hers as he shuffled through some papers on his desk. "We've had a lot of complaints about you." Her stomach dropped. She had expected this, but hearing the words out loud hit harder than she imagined. "Complaints?" Tiffany asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "From who?" "From the customers," Danny said, not looking at her. "You're causing a scene. You're disrupting the service. People are uncomfortable with your attitude." Tiffany's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her anger rising, threatening to boil over. "What did I do that was so bad?" "I did my job. I just didn't let Greg talk down to me." Danny sighed and finally met her eyes. "It's not just him. We've had complaints from others too. You've crossed the line. We're a business, Tiffany. We can't afford to lose clients over personal issues." She stood there frozen as his words sank in. She wasn't just fighting Greg. She was fighting the system. Fighting a world that had always dismissed her, ignored her, told her that she didn't matter. "What are you saying?" Tiffany's voice cracked, but she fought the tears. "You're firing me?" Danny hesitated. "We don't want to, but if you can't follow the rules, if you can't keep the peace, then yeah, it's the only option left." Tiffany could feel the walls closing in on her. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She wanted to scream, to say something, anything, to make him understand how unfair this was. But all she could do was stand there, numb, her mind spinning. "I did what I had to do," she whispered, more to herself than to Danny. "I stood up for myself." Danny shook his head, clearly tired. "I know, but it's not that simple, Tiffany. This is about the bigger picture. It's not just about you and Greg. It's about the reputation of this place. It's about making sure we keep the peace so the money keeps coming in." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The reputation of the place. The money. That's all it was about. Her dignity, her worth. They didn't matter. Not in this world. Not to these people. "I'll go," Tiffany said quietly, her voice cold. She turned on her heel, walking out of the office, her legs shaky beneath her. But as she walked back to the front of the restaurant, she saw him. Greg. He was sitting at his usual spot, surrounded by his colleagues, laughing loudly, like everything was just fine. Like nothing had happened, like he wasn't the one who had started all of this. Tiffany could feel her blood boiling. She wasn't even sure if she could hold it together anymore. As she walked past his table, Greg caught her eye. His smug smile was back. "Hey!" he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope I didn't offend you too much the other day. You seem a little off tonight." Tiffany stopped in her tracks, her hand clenched tightly around the tray she was holding. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, ready to explode. She was done being the quiet, invisible worker. She was done playing by their rules. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low and trembling with emotion. "You don't know anything about me and you don't care. You just wanted to feel better about yourself, huh? By putting me down." Greg laughed as if she were the joke. "Oh, come on, it was just a comment." "You're overreacting." Tiffany's heart raced, the frustration building inside her. "No, Greg, I'm not overreacting. You've made a habit of making people like me feel less than human. But I'm done. You don't get to walk all over me anymore. Not now, not ever again." The entire restaurant fell silent. It was as if the whole world had paused, everyone watching, waiting for the storm to break. Tiffany could feel the weight of every eye on her, but she didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. Free from the silence, from the judgment, from the need to make herself small just to survive. Greg's smirk faltered for a moment. "What's your problem, huh? This is just how things work around here." "No," Tiffany said, her voice steady, louder now. "This is how things worked." But not anymore. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the restaurant. She didn't care about the whispers behind her, didn't care about the looks of disapproval from her co-workers. All she cared about was getting out. Getting away from a place that had never valued her as a person. A place that would rather lose her than lose a regular like Greg. As Tiffany stepped into the cool night air, she felt like she was walking away from more than just a job. She was walking away from the chains that had held her down for so long. The sense of freedom that washed over her was overwhelming. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't go back to that life. Not after what had happened. Tiffany took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But as she walked down the sidewalk, the weight of everything hit her all at once. She had lost her job. She had lost the stability she'd worked so hard for. And for what? She thought about her mother, about the dreams she'd always had of opening her own art gallery, about the life she had hoped for. Was it all just a pipe dream? Could she really make a future for herself now? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Kayla. "Tiff, I just saw you leave." "What happened?"
Are you okay?
Tiffany stood still for a moment, staring at the screen. Her heart ached, but she couldn't hold back the tears anymore. The injustice, the heartbreak, it was all too much. She knew she had to keep fighting, but right now, in this moment, she just needed to breathe. "I'm okay," she typed back, her hands shaking. "But I think I'm going to be all right. I just need some time." Tiffany put her phone back in her pocket and kept walking, one step at a time. Tiffany's footsteps echoed through the empty streets as she walked away from the Velvet Lounge. The cool night air felt refreshing against her skin, but the ache in her chest was still raw. She had no idea what was going to happen next. No job, no security, just a burning desire to stand up for herself and for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. She had lost her job, but in a way, she felt like she had won something bigger. It wasn't the kind of victory most people would see. No, this wasn't a win in the traditional sense. She didn't walk away with a fat paycheck or an apology from Greg or anyone at the restaurant. But Tiffany had walked away with something more valuable than all of that. She had walked away with her dignity. She had stood up for herself in a world that never gave her a chance to do so. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As she sat on the steps outside her apartment, her phone buzzed again. It was Kayla. "Tiff, you okay?" "You got this." "I know you do." Tiffany smiled through her tears and typed back, "I think I finally get it. It's not about fighting for a seat at their table anymore. It's about building my own table." She knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was. But what Tiffany had learned in that moment, what she had come to realize over the course of this long, exhausting journey, was that no one could take away her power unless she let them. They couldn't silence her unless she chose to remain silent. And for the first time, she felt the weight of that truth settle deep inside her. But as she sat there, thinking about the future, her mind started to wander back to what had really been at stake. Tiffany wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been pushed down, stepped on, or told they didn't belong. She was fighting for all the people who had been forced to smile and keep quiet, to suffer in silence because the system wasn't designed to protect them. She thought about the other workers at the Velvet Lounge, the ones who had stayed quiet, afraid to rock the boat, afraid of losing their jobs. She thought about the microaggressions they dealt with every day, the subtle but painful slights that piled up over time until they couldn't take it anymore. Tiffany knew that her confrontation with Greg was just one moment in a long history of racial bias and systemic oppression. It wasn't just her fight. It was everyone's fight. And that was where the real change had to start, with people refusing to stay silent. With people standing up for what was right, even when the consequences felt too big to face. With people like her, like them, saying, enough. In the weeks that followed, Tiffany's story spread. It wasn't some headline-grabbing scandal. There wasn't a viral hashtag or a rally outside the restaurant. But word got out. Her friends, her co-workers, even strangers started reaching out to her. They thanked her for speaking out, for showing them that it was okay to stand up. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about choosing to act when it felt impossible to do so. Tiffany's journey didn't end that night, though. It was just beginning. She didn't know what the future held, whether she'd ever find a new job in the restaurant industry or if she'd go down a completely different path. But she had a vision now, a vision of a world where people didn't just accept the status quo, a world where they fought for fairness, for justice, for equality, a world where silence was no longer an option. As Tiffany sat on those steps, looking up at the stars, she asked herself one last question. How many other people are out there who need to find their voice? And how many of us are willing to help them find it? She didn't have all the answers. But she knew this. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over as long as people continued to suffer in silence, as long as injustice was allowed to thrive in the shadows. And Tiffany wasn't about to let that happen. Not on her watch. Not anymore. As Tiffany moved forward, her life wasn't just about finding a new job anymore. It was about changing the world around her. And that's what the real fight was about. For everyone watching this, for everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, the question remains, what will you do when it's your turn to stand up? Will you stay silent, or will you use your voice to make the world a little bit better? Because every voice matters, and sometimes it only takes one person to make a difference.